But thank you all for being here. I cannot believe the crowd of the community leaders in this room today. So it's an honor simply that everyone showed up. I can assure you Matt will not disappoint. We're all here today in this swank hotel room, dressed literally like royalty, talking about our kids in college and our summer vacation. How is this all possible? You know, this is not the story of human history. It's just the last 2 to 3 centuries that the human condition just dramatically changed. Not subtle improvements, a dramatic change in the human condition. Power of monarchies was limited, representative governments were formed, and then limited power of representative government. The importance of the individual, the rights and the sanctity of the individual has grown. Now, it took a long time until recently to spread that broadly and inclusively, but we've seen just a tremendous 2 or 3 centuries. In summary, it's the arrival and the spread of human liberty. Human liberty and freedom has doubled life expectancies, broadened our horizons. Innovation, which Matt is going to talk about today, of course, is a huge part of it. When you set humans free, what do? They do all sorts of things, because we all have different dreams and wishes. But the pace of innovation is just dramatic, which is a great story. But of course, anything that succeeds or works comes under threat by forces that are threatened by it. This is going to be no different. Matt, I'll say in brief, I've known Matt for 8 years. I've been reading his works since I was in graduate school, so 30 years ago. Matt was the science editor at The Economist. He became the US editor of The Economist. My brief intro to Matt is smart, thoughtful, articulate, and courageous. After completing a PhD in Oxford in life sciences, Matt, as they say, worked for The Economist. And The Economist, for those that don't know, a British magazine, this is the UK bastion of free peoples and free trade. Started 150 years ago when free trade was first arriving in the United Kingdom and changing the world. Walter Bagehot was the editor and an incredibly articulate defender of free markets and free trade. Bagehot became popular again during the financial crisis because he wrote a tremendous book about banks and panics. Unfortunately, about 15 years ago, The Economist lost its way as truly a bastion of free people and free trades, and so it lost Matt Ridley. Matt went on to write books. After a tremendous book on the evolutionary forces in the animal kingdom, Matt moves to focus on humans. His book, The Origin of Virtue, convincingly argues that cooperation and virtue are just as deeply rooted in human nature as selfishness. Matt took this idea further in the best-selling tour de force, The Rational Optimist. You're all getting a signed copy of it. The Rational Optimist eloquently illustrates that human advancement is driven by the free and vibrant interaction of human ideas, not by command and control or a grand plan. Matt's books have sold over 1 million copies and been translated into 30 languages. His TED Talk, When Ideas Have Sex, has over 2 million views. Perhaps the word sex got the additional 1 million views. Matt has been a powerful force in the last 2 decades in the realm of ideas. He writes a regular column for the Wall Street Journal, or he did, for the London Times, for the Telegraph, numerous magazines. Liz and I were at his house 5 years ago in England, and a vacancy came in the House of Lords in England. Matt had never been in politics at all, and Liz, rather aggressive, chided him and said, "You should run. You go, there's a spot. You should go." And you never win the first time. I don't know if I want to go into politics. And Matt did run, and he did win the first time he ran for office. Matt has done 2 things I think are exceptional. There's 2 topics near and dear to my heart. One, because it's huge for the world, this question of climate change. What is it? What does it mean? What are the impacts? What are the trade-offs? This is a massive issue. And so little of it is rational discussion of data in an open interchange that you need in a free and vibrant society. The easiest thing, and of course it's what most people do, is just shut up or keep your head down. If you want to talk about data and trade-offs, that is a very bumpy road. I do it myself. I don't think anyone cares that I do it. Matt has taken this on too, and tremendous fire. But where is this society if we're not willing to engage in free and open debate and ideas? This is critical. The same thing is true with the shale revolution. People see the economics impact of it as tremendous. But of course, like all things, it involves trade-offs, real trade-offs that need to be openly and honestly discussed. And sometimes they are, but often they aren't. And our industry has been, I would say nicely, not very effective at explaining the impacts and the trade-offs in everything we do. And I find it ironic that the most articulate defender of the American shale revolution isn't American. In fact, he lives in England, and not just in England, he lives in a town in England that's famous for something else, Newcastle, right? This is the original coal capital of the world, the industry most threatened by the shale revolution. And Matt has been a tireless and, most importantly, articulate, passionate defender of the trade-offs involved in the shale revolution. I'm going to welcome to the stage my friend, author, and thinker, Matt Ridley. He's going to talk about the forces that have helped build our quality of life we have, and he's going to take Q&A and dialogue at the end. But thank you for coming today. I really am thrilled to see the audience in this room.
Thank you, Chris, very much indeed for that immensely generous introduction. Really, Chris exemplifies everything that I try and write about in my books, that if you allow people freedom to use their talents, they will do incredible things to change the world. And when you think that back in 1997, some of Chris's ideas about what happens a mile underground to small fissures in rocks has changed the planet, the geopolitics of the planet, the economics of the planet, in extraordinary ways. It's a remarkable example of human transformation. He's also a very persuasive man, as you all know, and I think I may have made a mistake in dropping him an email a few months ago, saying, "I'm passing through Denver. Be nice to see you." Next thing I know, I'm talking to 180 people. It's brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Chris. Now, one's not supposed to quote Woody Allen these days, but he did say something quite funny some years ago. He said, "Mankind stands at a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness. The other to total extinction. But we must choose between the two." And he was mocking the way people talk about the future. Basically, we talk in terms of competing pessimisms about what's likely to go wrong in the future. And yet, over the last 200 years, as Chris said, we've seen the most extraordinary improvements in human nature. And just to get across how little we realize this is happening, my late friend, the great Hans Rosling, did a rather clever experiment a few years before he died. He asked 1,000 people this question. In the last 20 years, has the proportion of the world's population that lives in extreme poverty doubled, halved, or stayed the same? And out of these 1,000 people, 65%, 2/3, thought that the proportion living in extreme poverty had doubled. 5% thought it had halved. The 5% were right, the 65% are wrong. The proportion living in extreme poverty has halved in 20 years. But he thought about it a bit more, and then he said, well, hang on. If I wrote those 3 answers on 3 bananas and threw them to a chimpanzee and measured which banana got picked up first, the chimpanzee would get the right answer 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. They would do 7 times as well as human beings in answering this question about human society. How can that be? What this means is that we're not just plagued by ignorance about the world, we're actually plagued by things that we know which are not true. You could have written a newspaper headline this morning that read 137,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty yesterday. It would have been true. You could have written it yesterday and it would have been true then too. You could have written it any day in the last 20 years and it would have been true. And yet, of course, it's never been written as a newspaper headline because on the whole, the good news is gradual and the bad news is sudden and more newsworthy. In my lifetime, the lifespan of the average person has been going up at the rate of about 5 hours per day. The chances of children dying in infancy has gone down by 2/3 in that time. Nothing like this has ever happened to a human generation before. We're healthier, happier, cleverer, cleaner, kinder, safer, freer, more peaceful, and more equal than anyone who's ever lived before. Think about inequality. People in poor countries have been getting rich faster than people in rich countries over the last few decades, particularly over the last 10 years. So we're inevitably seeing better equality. It's time we told young people this, because most of them will not have heard it from their teachers. And they won't hear it from the media either, because good news is no news. As John Stuart Mill said, it is not the person who hopes when others despair, but the person who despairs when others hope, who is regarded as a sage. Now, what's the cause of this great enrichment of humanity? The answer, in a word, is innovation. Most of it comes about because people have found new tools and new rules by which to improve society. But what is innovation? And why does it happen to us and not to rabbits or rocks? Why is innovation resented, frustrated, attacked, and ignored by so many people when it's obviously the cause of so much improvement? Back in 1679, a man named William Petty wrote this: "When a new invention is first propounded, in the beginning every man objects, and the poor inventor runs the gaunt loop of all petulant wits." Still true today. So I want to talk about innovation, and in particular 5 aspects of it that I think are important. The first is that it happens really mostly by recombination. It happens by taking existing ideas and putting them together and making new ideas, which is, by the way, how biological innovation happens, by recombining genes. Brian Arthur has pointed out that every technology we possess, when you think about it, is really a combination of other technologies. This is what I mean by ideas having sex, different things coming together and producing new things. My favorite example is the pill camera, which takes a picture of your insides if you swallow it. It came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. And of course it follows, therefore, that if ideas are to meet and mate and have baby ideas, then free exchange is vital to the progress of innovation. If you isolate people, you will cut down their rate of innovation. In fact, it's worse than that. If you isolate people enough, innovation actually goes backwards. And we know that really because of examples like the island of Tasmania, which was cut off and became an island 10,000 years ago, and was then entirely cut off from the rest of humanity for 10,000 years. And during that time, not only did they not get, the people who lived in Tasmania did not get access to technologies that were invented after their isolation, such as the boomerang, which was invented in mainland Australia after that, but they actually gave up some of the technologies they already had. So progressively, over the next 10,000 years, they lost the ability to make bone tools altogether. And it turns out that we need a big enough population of specialized people doing different things to be able to even maintain the technology we have, let alone improve on it. The secret of society is that we work for each other. We do what we're good at, and we swap the results. We move away from self-sufficiency and towards interdependence. We specialize as producers so that we can diversify as consumers. And this habit of exchange is a unique human adaptation. It seems to go back at least 100,000 years, according to the archaeological evidence for trade. As Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make free and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. So the deepest cooperation we achieve in society is really what we achieve by buying and selling, by depending on each other for what we need. By collaborating through commerce, we do things that are beyond the capacity of the human mind to comprehend. There's a wonderful essay, which some of you will know, by an American economist called Leonard Read, called I Pencil, which is about a simple pencil. And this pencil tries to work out how he came into existence. And he researches the subject very thoroughly and comes to the conclusion that millions of people contributed to his creation. Because, you know, there was a man cutting down a tree whose wood was going to be used in the factory to make, and then there was a man making coffee whose coffee was going to be drunk by the man cutting down the tree. And they were all contributing to the creation of the pencil. But what was odd was that amongst all these millions of people helping to make a pencil, there is not a single human being who knew how to make a pencil. The knowledge wasn't shared, wasn't inside a single head. It was held between heads. And that's true of almost everything we do. Human intelligence is a collective phenomenon, a distributed brain, a cloud. A Scottish philosopher by the name of Adam Ferguson in the 18th century said that many aspects of human society are the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. And what he meant by that was things like the English language. The English language is obviously a man-made thing. It's not a natural phenomenon, but it didn't have an inventor, and it doesn't have a central planning committee that decides how it changes. It comes about by the interaction of lots of different people. And the same is true of the internet. The internet has evolved from the way we interact with each other without at any sense being designed or planned by anybody. And this, I think, brings us to the point that innovation is an evolutionary, incremental thing. It happens by moving from one thing to the next in a gradual, to the adjacent possible. If you look at something like Moore's law, you see that the doubling of transistors on a chip happens every 18 months or whatever. But once we knew that, we weren't able to cheat it. We weren't able to break the law. We weren't able to jump ahead. And we do far more trial and error in innovation than we usually admit to. If you talk to anyone, talk to Chris about how fracking started, there's an enormous amount of experimentation goes into it. It's not a matter of suddenly having one bright idea. So we probably put too much emphasis on single genius inventors and on great leaps. Because the other weird thing about innovation is that it sometimes seems surprisingly inevitable. When something is invented, there's usually somebody jumps up and says, hang on, I invented that too. And he's usually right. Simultaneous invention is an incredibly common phenomenon. Almost every technology has rival inventors who invented it around the same time. In the case of the light bulb, there are 23 different people with good claim to have invented the light bulb independently in the 1870s. Edison is only one of them. And if Edison had fallen under a tram and died, we'd still have had light bulbs because there were plenty of other people around to invent them. If Sergey Brin had never met Larry Page, we'd still have search engines, wouldn't we? There were already lots on the market. So there's a sort of inevitability about this. The second point I think that is crucial about innovation is that it must be felt by the consumer, not the producer, if it's to do any benefits. It's no good inventing something that helps someone to produce something if it doesn't produce a benefit down the line for a consumer. And the great thing about innovation is that it can turn luxuries into necessities. If you want to read a book this evening, preferably my book, by the light of a compact fluorescent light bulb, an 18-watt bulb, for 1 hour, how long do you have to work to be able to afford the electricity that kept that light bulb going? And the answer is about, well, it's less than half a second. Half a second of work on the average US wage will get you an 18-watt bulb burning for an hour. Back in 1950, your grandparents with a compact fluorescent bulb, with an incandescent bulb, and the then average wage rate would have had to work for 8 seconds. So that's 7.5 seconds you've got that your grandparents didn't have, in which you can fulfill a different need or just do nothing if you want. That's economic growth, reduction in the amount of time it takes to fulfill a need. But back in 1880, with a kerosene lamp, it would have cost you 15 minutes of work to earn that much light. And in 1800, with a tallow candle, 6 hours. 6 hours of light to earn 1 hour of 6 hours of work to earn 1 hour of light. Which means, of course, that the average person couldn't afford a candle in 1800. That's a measure of the extraordinary improvements that innovation has brought. As Joseph Schumpeter put it, the capitalist achievement does not consist of making more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls. And I think we need to remember that with things like electricity, where the great benefit of electricity is not producing it, as sometimes people talk about how many people are employed in producing electricity, but in consuming it, what it enables you to do. And we have to remember that when we apply artificial intelligence as well. Innovations that increase the price of something are often largely pointless unless they give some huge new benefit. This is what worries me about, for example, electric cars, is that until they can really deliver price improvements, they might not be as useful as we hope they're going to be. I think innovation is the mother as often as it is the daughter of science. We tend to think of science as being the thing that produces the ideas which then get applied into the technology. It's very often the other way around. Think of steam, the whole steam revolution, which began in the northeast of England where I live. That was done by mostly illiterate people who knew how to tinker with machines, and it led to the science of thermodynamics rather than the other way around. And a very recent example of the same phenomenon is that CRISPR, gene editing, this new brilliant technique for very precise editing of genes, sounds like a perfect example of esoteric blue sky science leading to a practical application where we can now use it in agriculture and medicine. But actually, when you look at the history of that, why did they discover this strange system of palindrome repeats inside bacteria? Because the yogurt industry had a problem with infections in its cultures and was trying to solve this problem, which was viruses infecting the bacteria in the cultures. And so they were studying bacterial genomes to try and find out what made the bacteria immune to these viruses. And they stumbled on this immune system, which had these palindromic repeats in it, which turned out to be something you could turn into a mechanism for editing genes in human beings and other creatures. Most of the technologies that are useful to us today, like mobile phones or search engines, had surprisingly little input from science in them. And likewise, there's a big argument about whether it's the public sector or the private sector that comes up with innovation most. And some people have argued that if you look at the iPhone, it's full of things like microprocessors and solid-state hard drives and LCDs and lithium batteries and GPS and cellular networks, which were invented by the public sector. So essentially, it's government that delivers all these benefits. My problem with that is that if that's the case, how come innovation in the public sector itself is so sluggish? If you look at productivity in government during the era of computerization, it's almost zero. How can that possibly be? How can you apply computers across government and still not improve productivity? And also, of course, yes, the public sector has spent a huge amount on R&D over the last 50 years, so it would be quite disappointing if it hadn't produced some innovations. I mention this partly because I've come across this argument with respect to fracking and shale gas. Some people saying, well, actually, the whole thing started in the public sector and the private sector just picked it up. So I asked my friend Chris Wright if that's true. And it's basically not in the least true. Yes, there was work in the public sector, both before, during, and after, some of it funded by the industry, some of it not. But it's a tiny proportion of the enormous amount of trial and error that had to happen. At the moment, with the artificial intelligence revolution gathering pace, and I've just been sitting on a select committee in the UK Parliament looking at the application of artificial intelligence, there's a lot of concern about technology leading to unemployment. And I think the answer here is quite simple. Innovation does not cause unemployment, quite the reverse. Ever since the threshing machine, we've been worrying that new machines would put people out of work and there would therefore be less work to do. But of course what we do is we free people to work in other uses which we actually want them to do. We don't want everybody to have to go and work in the fields in order to be able to survive. We'd like people to be able to provide us with other services as well. In the early 1960s, President Johnson had a commission to look at technological unemployment, what the effect of automation in factories. And it was a blue ribbon panel with all the top economists of the day, J.K. Galbraith, people like that. And it came to the conclusion that there was a serious risk that there would be no jobs for anybody within a few decades. Well, that turned out to be wrong, as you can see. Certainly my country has pretty well full employment at the moment, with a huge number of women having joined the workforce in the last 2 generations and so on. And the way I think to think about this is to think of it that actually there has been a reduction in the amount of work available as a result of automation, but we've shared it out in the form of leisure. In Britain, in 1900, people lived till the age of about 60, and they worked about 60 hours a week, and they started work about the age of 15. And that meant that they've spent 25% of their life on the planet at work. It's a surprisingly small number, but when you take out nighttime and childhood, it comes down to about 25% of life would be spent at work. Today, that number, if you live till 80 and you spend about half your life in education or retirement, and you work a 39-hour week, you spend 10% of your life at work. May not feel like that, but it's quite a small proportion, isn't it? Most people are very surprised by that number. They think it's much higher. But if we've managed to go from 25% of people's lives spent at work down to 10% of people's lives spent at work without any great disruption and without anybody dying of boredom, then maybe we can do a little more. Maybe if the machines can take another 2 or 3%, it won't be a problem. So that's the way I reassure myself about artificial intelligence. There's one kind of innovation that I think is absolutely central and is often not treated with the delicacy that it deserves, and that's innovation in the energy sector. Because when you think about it, everything that human society creates is as a result of energy. Energy is the absolutely vital resource that we need. The structures in this room are, in a sense, congealed energy. They're the work of machines and people in the past, capitalized into capital structures. We've used energy to reverse entropy to the point of creating improbable structures like these wonderful glass things in the ceiling. And so it's absolutely central to make sure that the supply of energy to a society is affordable. Otherwise, we'll not be able to continue to do this. And that's what worries me about what's happening in Europe at the moment, where we are pushing up the price of energy fairly drastically in order to subsidize low-carbon energy sources. And it feels to me like that is a mistake, because the amount of, if you're going to reverse entropy, if you're going to create order in the world, you need access to energy. Why do people resist innovation? Mainly because they have vested interests against it. Brink Lindsay and Steve Tellers have a new book called The Captured Economy, which point out just how many people just how many of society's structures give us an incentive against innovation. For example, intellectual property. I'm an author. That means I get copyright on my books. Thanks to lobbying by the Walt Disney Company and others, that copyright will last for 70 years after my death. My children, my grandchildren, can rake in a very, very small fortune as a result of my work. Who had that idea? Where did that idea come from? It's ridiculous. Far too much intellectual property is getting in the way of innovation. You see it in the problem of patent thickets and patent trolls and these kind of things, things that are making it hard to do innovation. Occupational licensing, another barrier to entry that is increasingly giving people an incentive to resist innovation. Frederick Ericsson and Bjorn Weigel have written a book pointing out that a lot of big companies increasingly are not investing in innovation. They're increasingly hesitant to invest and innovate. As they put it, globalization is actually making this worse. In several sectors, the growing influence of large and global firms has increasingly had the effect of slowing down market dynamism and reducing the spirit of corporate experimentation. Western economies have developed a near obsession with precautions that simply cannot be married to a culture of experimentation. Which brings me to my least favorite principle in the European Union, which is the precautionary principle, which is the idea that we must be better than safe than sorry, so we must, if we don't know the risk of something, we must not take that risk. This holds the new to a higher standard than the old, and it ignores the risks of doing nothing. It says that, you know, if whatever pesticide you're using at the moment is fine, but don't, whatever you do, invent a better one, because that might have its own risks. We've always had versions of the precautionary principle. I don't know how many of you know that by the early 1940s, 2/3 of states in the United States had banned margarine on spurious health grounds because of lobbying by the dairy industry. Or that when the umbrella was invented, the coach drivers of Great Britain lobbied hard to have it banned because people might walk instead of getting in coaches if they had an umbrella. Or that the American Musicians Union managed to ban all recorded music on the radio for a number of years in the early years of radio. There will always be people trying to stop innovations coming along. And a lot of our climate change policy is the ultimate precautionary principle, because in the name of preventing what is probably going to be fairly modest warming in 100 years' time, we're prepared to demand a huge cost today, even if that really hurts poor people, as a lot of the policies we're taking today are. I'm not someone who thinks there is no climate change. I think that I fully accept the science, but all that science points towards, in my view, is relatively modest climate change that will do very little harm for most of this century, and that we should be able to both adapt to and mitigate with the use of technology. One of the reasons my country voted 2 years ago to leave the European Union was because of the anti-innovation culture that emanates from Brussels. We want to be Hong Kong on Thames. We want to get out there and be a tiger economy again. And we felt that Brussels was stopping us doing that. And let me tell you a little story to illustrate that. My friend Sir James Dyson is the second richest person in Britain, hugely successful entrepreneur who invented the bagless vacuum cleaner. You may have seen them, you may even have one. And he discovered that the European Union was bringing in new rules, new standards for vacuum cleaners. And after heavy lobbying by Bosch in Germany, these standards said that vacuum cleaners must be tested without dust. Because vacuum cleaners with bags don't work quite as well when there's a lot of dust. Vacuum cleaners without bags go on working even when there's dust around. That's the whole point of them. So Bosch was worried about Dyson taking part of its market share, and so had lobbied hard to have these rules written. So Dyson sued the European Commission, and it went to the European Court of Justice, which had 2 German judges on the panel that day and ruled against Dyson. So he did a Freedom of Information Act for the correspondence between Bosch and the European Court of Justice and came up with a treasure trove of corporate lobbying. And he appealed and he won. And there it stands at the moment. We don't yet know how the European Court of Justice is going to climb off the high horse it's got on. But these are the kinds of gaunt loops that the inventor has to jump through. There's a phrase called permissionless innovation, which is essentially when the government gets out the way and lets inventors get on and see what they come up with. And to a degree, you had it here for the shale gas industry in a way that no other part of the world allowed. There was a wildcat experimental industry out there that was able to try different things, a lot of which were not going to work and some of which ended up working. And if that hadn't existed here, the world would not have got the shale revolution. In a very much smaller way, the UK has found itself at the forefront of a small piece of permissionless innovation, which is the vaping revolution, the electronic cigarette revolution. Vaping has taken off much more in the UK than any other European country and is officially encouraged by government bodies in the UK, unlike in the US. And so is actually doing a huge job of, we're now the second lowest smoking country in Europe, and we're driving out smoking by lots of people taking up vaping. You go to London, you see people vaping all over the place. And it's a far, far less harmful thing than smoking, so it's on the whole a good thing. And I'm trying to understand why Britain took stole a bit of a march here. And I've discovered that when David Cameron got into power in 2010, he set up something called the Behavioural Insights Team in number 10 Downing Street, otherwise known as the Nudge Unit, because it was trying to, do these nudge ideas that were coming out of Cass Sunstein and people like that. And a friend of mine who's an advertising executive called Rory Sutherland went to see David Halpern, who ran the Nudge Unit, and pulled an electronic cigarette out of his pocket. And Halpern said, "What the heck is that?" And he said, "Well, it's this electronic cigarette. They're starting to use them in the Far East, and they're a much better thing than cigarettes." And so Halpern prepared a research paper on it and put a memo in the Prime Minister's in-tray saying, if the public health lobby comes along and tries to ban this, don't let them. This might be a good thing. And as a result, Britain resisted the preventive, precautionary bans. For example, Australia banned these things off and still has banned them. If you get off an airplane in Australia and pull out your vaping device, you're breaking the law. And most European countries are similar. So it's incredible what human beings will achieve if you just get out of their way. It's as simple as that. Peter Thiel has made the point that permissionless innovation has been available to people working with bits, but not to people working with atoms, largely, over the last 20 years. And that's why you've seen so much digital innovation rather than in other areas. After the Facebook scandals of recent months, I suspect that's changing. Now, one of the reasons a lot of people don't like innovation is because they think that it leads to environmental destruction. But I have good news, because the more we innovate, the better we look after this planet. That is now really clear from lots of data. For example, the amount of land we need to produce a given amount of food is 68% less than it was 50 years ago. So if we hadn't invented new fertilizers, new pesticides, new varieties of crops, all these new machinery, we would have had to plow pretty well every rainforest under the plow by now in order to feed today's population. And I got involved a few years ago in writing about the phenomenon of global greening, which is the idea that there's actually more green vegetation on the planet than there was a generation ago. To the tune of, it's equivalent to a continent the size of the continental United States entirely covered in green vegetation. It's that big a change that we've seen. And NASA has the data. It comes from satellites, and it ends up in something called the Leaf Area Index. And it shows this spectacular greening in all ecosystems, in rainforest, in deserts, well, not in full deserts, but in semi-deserts, and in agricultural land, everywhere. And they reckon 70% of the cause of that is the extra carbon dioxide in the air because of burning fossil fuels. So this is a terribly inconvenient fact. And whenever I write about it, they get very, very cross and say, you mustn't say this because although it's true, it's not helpful. And what about wildlife? I mean, surely we're losing all these species and so on. Well, here's a fact to consider. Why are lions decreasing, wolves increasing, and tigers holding their own at the moment? And the answer is because lions live in poor countries, wolves live in rich countries, and tigers live in middle-income countries. It's that simple. The richer you make countries, the more they start to look after their wildlife and their forests. So, I think innovation is a good thing. I think we should embrace it. I think we need to teach the value of a free and open society, the importance of wealth creation and social justice. Our films and books are suffused with the worship of the very chiefs, priests, and thieves that made pre-commercial society so miserable, but they reserve their scorn for the merchants who caused this great enrichment. As Lord Macaulay said in 1830, and how much more true it is today, we cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say society has reached a turning point, that we have seen our best days. But so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration ahead of us? Thank you. Shall I stay up here for questions?